Hello and welcome to the I3 lecture series, hosted by the Masters in Digital Photography program at the School of Visual Arts. We're thrilled to have photographer Bruce Polin as tonight's guest speaker. Born and raised in Brooklyn, Bruce graduated with a BFA in photography from NYU. After graduation, he assisted photographer Neil Slavin and was a personal printer for Rosalind Solomon. In the mid-80s, Bruce managed an art gallery in the East Village at a time when the neighborhood was a mecca for creativity, with luminaries like Keith Haring, Basquiat, Cindy Sherman, Laurie Simmons, and David Wojnarowicz making their mark on art and culture. Deep Park, his most recent series, has been featured by Lens Culture, Hawk Magazine, the New York Times Lens blog, and was a top 50 critical mass finalist for Photo Lucida. Please help me welcome Bruce Polin to our lecture series.
So yeah, thank you, Jaime, for offering me this really lovely platform to talk about some of my work. I've been doing photography a long time, really since the 70s. And I make pictures because it's what I love doing, and it gives me a connection to the world in a way that nothing else really can. And we all really need connection, especially these days. So I've had a pretty wide range of jobs over the years, and I'll touch upon a few of these during this presentation. But I'll say that I always managed to somehow incorporate photography into everything I did. It was my way of making whatever the situation was, making it mine. So as you mentioned, Jaime, I did assist for Neil Slavin and printed for Rosalind, managed an art gallery, and I did a lot of work for the Museum of a Moving Image in Astoria. And I even started a Latin music company. So getting to this point really hasn't been what you might consider a straight line. Lots of things led up to my current series, Deep Park. And I think it's important to understand that it didn't happen in a bubble. Officially, it began in 2016, but unofficially, I think it began decades ago. So let's start. So I grew up in Canarsie, a working class neighborhood in Southeast Brooklyn. That's where this was shot. My dad was a commercial artist, and coincidentally, he was one of the first graduates of School of Visual Arts, which was then called Cartoonists and Illustrators School. So Canarsie was seeing a lot of new housing construction in the 60s, a lot of Jewish and Italian families moving in from neighboring Brownsville, East New York, Red Hook, Lower East Side. Canarsie was their piece of the American dream, with a patch of grass out front, little backyard, the barbecue in. And it was very modest brick row houses like this. This is very typical of Canarsie houses. So here are a few pictures of Canarsie that I actually found online. They're not my pictures, but I wanted to give you a sense of what I saw there as a kid. These could have been friends of mine. They weren't, but it's a very familiar picture to me. The feel and everything about it feels very familiar. And here's a photo I really love, and I wish I did take it. It's so beautiful. It was shot in front of the Brooklyn Houses, which is a public housing complex on the edge of Canarsie. And it was one of the few places where Black or Latinos families lived in Canarsie. Most other places in Canarsie were pretty much exclusively white. So I think this picture illustrates the excessive confrontational bravado that was pervasive in Canarsie. And I was a short, skinny kid who did art. So needless to say, I really didn't fit in that well in this model. And the truth is, I really hated it. if you didn't look or act a certain way, there were problems. So look, I'm sure Canarsie wasn't only like this everywhere all the time, but I saw a lot of this, and there was a good degree of intimidation as a kid. At that time, Canarsie was known for its extreme racial unrest. So the white, Jewish, and Italian reaction to minorities moving in or trying to buy homes in Canarsie is really well documented. Violence and bias attacks were prevalent and continued into the 90s even. And this guy here, his name is Brian Fining, and he firebombed a real estate office for just showing houses to people of color. So yeah, I had a lot of mixed feelings about growing up there. But no worries, this is me handling the situation in 1968 to take care of everything. I used humor to deflect and diffuse, something I still do, like right this moment. And I learned to run fast when I was a kid. So, fledgling ventriloquist, trying to figure out a way to navigate the world. I do photography because I need something to give me voice. I never had a whole lot of confidence speaking directly. And I always felt that I could speak more eloquently, more effectively through some medium. And later on, I loved Laurie Simmons' obsession with ventriloquist dummies. In the 80s, I actually started a little photo service for galleries and artists. And one of the perks of that business was getting to see fresh, brand new work from people like Simmons and Cindy Sherman and Robert Longo, right after it was made and before the public got to see it. So that was a real privilege. So this is a shot from Lee Friedlander, his TV series from the 60s, which I thought would be appropriate because as a kid, I experienced the world through the filter of TV, and I consumed a lot of it. And it's really how I experienced culture outside of Canarsie. I took refuge in TV and movies. And my favorites were shows like Star Trek and Twilight Zone. And I really think I learned a lot about lighting and composition on a visceral level, just watching these shows. And I think it was definitely kind of an education for me. There was a guy named Jerry Finnerman who was the director of photography at Star Trek for the first couple of seasons. Really talented guy. Every one of his shots looked like a still studio portrait. Really beautiful. So I especially loved monster movies, the classics, and I couldn't get enough of them. I related to these guys. And so the transformation scenes were always the best. And I think we could all agree on that. The full moon, when a regular guy becomes something completely different, stronger, bigger, more capable of doing things that he didn't think were even possible. And for me, there's a lot of correlation to portraiture and the power of image, transformation. So theatrical makeup and makeup artists became really important to me. And I think the challenge of a makeup artist is really the same as a portrait photographer. How do you work respectfully and how do you elicit humanity in what you're creating? So I think I dealt with the alienation that I felt in Canarsie by locking myself up in the bathroom for a couple of hours and then emerging as something completely different. And I thought I was going to be a great makeup artist. So I got a camera to document my makeup jobs. And that was that. The camera really changed everything for me. It was kind of like magic. I could use it to express myself. And basically all I needed was light and maybe some kind of attitude. Makeup allowed me to look closer at faces and show that I could render certain things visible. And I try to do that with a camera. So my earliest exposure to photography as an art was through the monthly photo magazines. And that's where I originally learned about artists like Friedlander and Gary Winogrand and Diane Arbus and Lucas Samaras. And this was one of my very early pictures. And I included it in my portfolio when I applied to SVA in, I think, 1978. And I think it reflects my connection to science fiction and horror movies. And I also see a bit of Dwayne Michaels in there, who is also one of my heroes. Another SVA portfolio piece, very Twilight Zone. I remember being super proud of this picture. It was done entirely in the darkroom using 2 separate negatives and printing to one piece of photo paper. So there was a lot of trial and error, and I probably went through like a box of paper to get this print. I would like to mention a few publications that were important to me back then. The Time Life Library of Photography, classic. I loved these. Each volume focused on a different thing, and they were just amazing. They were printed gorgeous. And here are some pictures from the volume called The Art of Photography. And here's Emmett Gowan, Bruce Davidson, Diane Arbus, Andre Cortege. I really think you should go to eBay after this and find this. Richard Avedon, from pictures he did in the 40s in Italy. Gorgeous. This is a gorgeous, gorgeous picture. So another publication that had an early effect on me was this book, Suburbia, by Bill Owens, which was published in '73. I was familiar with, Robert Frank's The Americans and Larry Clark's Tulsa, which preceded this book, but I only got to see those through magazines. This is the first book that I ever held in my hands, first photo book that I held in my hands. And that was really, the tactile experience of that was really impactful. I loved this book. It wasn't artsy, it was very approachable, this book. In my first year at SVA, I started taking pictures sort of in the style of Bill Owens. He was my uncle and his brother. Here are my parents and a relative watching TV. And I just know that that show is called One Day at a Time with the actress Bonnie Franklin. And I know that's of interest to you. Friends of mine in Canarsie. A lot of TV watching. That was the show Taxi. So my mom and dad. This is a shot of my parents that was also done in my first year at SVA. My dad would take these opioid painkillers called Darvon, and he had this nighttime ritual of sitting on the edge of the bed for like 10 minutes, waiting for the Darvon to kick in, or maybe waiting for the Alka-Seltzer to kick in. He took Alka-Seltzer every night also. I think it's in the cup on that bedside table. It's, it's for indigestion. I think this image made me feel like I might have some capacity for portraiture. So my father was a really great supporter of my art, incredibly encouraging in whatever creative thing I was doing. And he was clearly a good sport. In my second year at SVA, I was working more and more on my portraiture skills, and both in the studio and on the street. Moving out of Canarsie became more of a priority for me. So after my second year at SVA, I dropped out. I took a job at the Parks Department and I moved out of my parents' house. I moved into a railroad flat in Kensington, Brooklyn, with 5 roommates, continued to do portraiture out of the apartment, mostly 4x5 large format work. I did a lot of portraits for my large rotating pool of roommates. And I was shooting this nice material called Polaroid Type 55, which yielded an instant print, a nice print, and a beautiful instant 4x5 negative, sort of instant. You had to put it in a clearing bath. But you could take that negative, go to the darkroom, and enlarge it to any size. And here's Danny, who's a roommate, and here's a succession of Polaroids that ends with the final enlargement that I decided to print. And so here it is. So this was a 20x24 enlargement printed in the darkroom. And those edges are indicative of Type 55 negative. And another roommate, Marina, and I really loved working with her. I think she really liked the idea of seeing herself in different ways. And here's the final enlarged image I printed in the darkroom. And I love this image for its openness and apparent honesty. I was starting to get portraiture at this point a little bit. The collaborative aspect of it. So a few years later, I returned to school, and I think because I needed some direction. And I ended up going to NYU Tisch because they threw a lot of money in my direction, and I took it. So I was now doing both field and studio portraiture using that nice Type 55 material. This is the observation deck of the Empire State Building, where I like to photograph tourists mostly. And I think it'd be impossible. I don't even think they let you take pictures up there today. Certainly not with a view camera, and it probably cost $75 or something. So in some of these images, I was purposely shifting focus, and I like the idea that you could change or modify the subject by turning a knob, and I like that plasticity and the ephemeral idea of the subject. These are a bit concept-driven for my taste now, but I still see some things that I think are beautiful about these. So I'd bring my speed graphic camera to Coney Island, and I'd set up on the boardwalk and engage with strangers. And I remember these guys, I loved them. And I remember using big blue flash bulbs. There was a big flash pan with a handle with this camera, like a press photographer. I was Ouija on the boardwalk. And on this particular day, on the boardwalk, I photographed this lovely Ukrainian family. And the longer I hung around, the bigger the family seemed to grow. And I remember them being really warm, and they loved to be photographed together. So, but those twin boys in the foreground, they just kind of arranged themselves in front of the camera. They didn't need any coaxing on my part. And I love these kids. They just seemed so ready to be photographed. And I didn't know who they were all these years until recently. They actually became very public figures within the past year, 35 years later. So here's what the Vindman twins look like today. Colonel Alexander Vindman testified in the impeachment hearings. And this is Alexander and his brother Yevgeny. This is a shot by Carol Kitman. And I keep finding myself doing this, going back and forth, looking at this picture and just being amazed that it's almost the same exact shot. It's really, that's the power of photography. It's amazing. So I tend to get really obsessive about things that I'm interested in. When my father died, I started listening to his old vinyl records, which were mostly Latin dance bands. And I fell in love with this music, with Latin music. And I started studying Latin percussion, and I even started a Latin music business called Descarga. And for over 20 years, Latin music was a central force in my life. And Descarga gave me license to continue making portraits of people that I was interested in. Like this guy, his name is Izzy Sanabria. He was the publisher of Latin New York magazine for like a long time. And he was also involved with the Fun All-Stars, and really an amazing guy. I loved his face. I thought he had such a beautiful face. I still do. And so this year is Ruben Blades in his hotel room. I think it was the St. Regis Hotel. He was in town because he was in a play he was doing with Mark Anthony. And so I always try to figure out how to incorporate photography no matter what kind of work I did. It was, again, my way of owning the situation. So here's a few more pics of Ruben Blades that I liked. So after Descarga, I made a little makeshift studio in my basement. And I wanted to return to photography in a controlled setting, specifically portraiture, in a very basic and essential way. And so I started shooting sheet film again, but this time with 8x10 film. It was a basement, so I didn't have natural light coming in, and I used these very cheap secondhand strobes that I bought on eBay. And my subjects were friends and family, people I knew. In some of these, I want to give you an idea of the studio setup. So I've shown you some of these kind of behind the scenesy things. It was really very simple, and the background was made from strips of newsprint that I taped together. It was translucent, so I could throw a light behind it, which would cancel in shadows that might get thrown on it. And those seams, the seams disappeared when you shot with large format, because the depth of field is really minimal. So I really like the way some vintage lenses render highlights in a luminous way, and how nice they transition to out of focus areas. I really want to be able to seduce you into the image, so you'll stay a while, and I want engagement. So maybe you'll find other things in the picture that you might be interested in. And with this project, I really had no other expectations but to try and make pictures that I liked. It was all self-contained and manageable. And it was a while since I practiced a real formalized way of shooting people like that. So it was a relearning process, relearning how to interact and how to light and how to operate the big camera. So, no matter how much you prepare for, I did a lot of preparation, testing and stuff before people came over, but no matter how much you prepare for it, a good shot is just going to be the confluence of some things that you just don't have control over. I've always loved the self-containment aspect of photography, the fact that I could begin and finish a project all on my own. You don't need a crew. You don't even need assistance. I would love assistance, but you don't need assistance. You can just do it. This is actually a guy named Jerry Gonzalez, a Latin musician. And I look at some of these pictures of people who have since passed away since I've photographed them. And the thought that all of these portraits that I've taken will eventually be portraits of people who died. And maybe it has something to do with coronavirus being always in my head. And when I look at the death toll every day, and it's so overwhelming, this whole thing. And it makes looking at these portraits more of a precious thing. Everything has more of an importance to me. So this is a digital eye test of a very old friend of mine who I went to SVA with. So, okay, these pictures, I need to talk about them a little bit because they're really the result of an exhaustive process. These sessions, they took a really long time. They weren't like 15 minutes. I think Louis sat for like 4 hours for me. And I kind of felt that we needed to get past exhaustion. Is usually where I saw the picture happen. Something that felt kind of real, like we were finally past chit chat or small talk and we're down to business. And I like watching that transition happen. So, it was really a grueling process. And I generally began it by telling whoever I was going to photograph that you're probably going to hate me by the end of this. So Louis, I hope you don't hate me. So I wonder if you see these pictures differently now that I've said that. And here you could see the kind of camera I was using and that I was really working from the side of the camera so I could connect. This is a person named Maya who I actually met in Prospect Park during the Deep Park series, but I felt it really belonged with basement portraiture because she came over for a portrait. So in early 2016, I was leaving the studio to shoot outside more often, and I was shooting strangers. And I'm not exactly what you might call a naturally sociable person. I'm really quite private. And the kind of photography that I was doing, you might think would be an odd choice because of that. But I really think it allows me to connect in a way that I wouldn't or couldn't otherwise. Soon, most of my work would be outdoors with strangers. And for most of this work, I was using an unusual twin lens 4x5 large format camera called the Gowland Flex. And as this body grew, I started to call this series Perfect Strangers. And at this point, I was going all over Brooklyn. And in hindsight, Perfect Strangers was like a stepping stone to Deep Park. So, okay, so I was still trying to figure out what I was doing, how I would eventually want to photograph. But I think I should talk a little bit about some of the forces at play that I think helped push me out of the comfort of my studio. And my feeling of frustration during the campaign that led to the 2016 election was getting progressively more intense, turning into depression and despair and anger. And this combination of feelings I had all the time. And I felt that civil discourse was pretty much thrown out the window. Any semblance of peace or civility in this country was being ripped apart, and I hated it. I resented it. And I'm not a naive person, so even if I knew that even if civility were an illusion, at least overt hate seemed to be kept partially in check before, and now that didn't seem to be the case. It was always in your face. So I think photographing strangers felt right to me because it offered me a different kind of connectedness that photographing my circle of friends and family couldn't provide. It was really a physical, organic reaction to what was going on around me. So anger was the motivational force, I think. I'm not saying it kept me completely in check, but it kept me busy, this project, which helped mitigate it. Anxiety could be a great force if it doesn't paralyze you. And this was shot by Kings Plaza Shopping Center in Brooklyn. So some tech info. Like I said, with this earlier work, I was using this Flex camera and much of it handheld. Later on, I would switch to 8x10. And I don't think these images are as intimate or personal as the Deep Park images would later be. So it was really a transformational process for me. Compared to Deep Park, these are slightly more documents than portraiture. I think some of them are beautiful, and there's definitely a change, though, that that came with a slower process. So this gentleman's name is Ra Amen, and after we shot this, we both started to walk home, and we were going in the same direction, so we were walking together, and then we kept taking the same turns together, and so at some point I'm in front of my house, and I said, okay, so this is me, where do you live? And he points to the house across the street, and so we lived across the street from each other for 15 years and didn't know each other. Granted, there were a bunch of people that lived in that house, but still, it's crazy. And we're all perfect strangers. So this is Sharon in Prospect Park, who would later become an important person to me. So in this picture, I was aware of the swan behind them, and I waited for it to go into position before I shot. And the woman's eyes darted to the side as soon as that happened. And, which made the image a little more interesting to me because it's like an invitation to create your own narrative for the shot. She was actually keeping her eye on like her 5 kids who were running around behind me. So I wonder if that takes some of the mystery out of that shot for you. I think some people go to the park to be alone with other people. So you can really see the size of the Flex camera here. And I like the idea of the camera, but I had technical issues with the focus. And you can actually see, if you tilt this camera, the top lens is no longer the same distance to your subject as the bottom lens. So that's going to throw off your focus. So it's an inherent liability with this camera, unless you're using it perfectly straight up and down, which you never do, or rarely do. So I was having trouble getting consistently critically sharp pictures. A few of these were shot with a 2¼ camera, and I would grab that smaller camera if I thought it was going to rain. So I stopped using the Gallon Flex because of those problems, and I started using an 8x10 field camera. I was already comfortable shooting 8x10 from the studio, basement studio, and the larger format really slowed things down a lot, but it resulted in a much more personal portrait. And I also, about this time, began using a wide angle lens for portraiture. So I had to get physically closer to fill the frame with the people I was shooting, which added an additional intimacy that wasn't there before. And I think this was the first usage of the wide angle lens. And I also love the added spatial tension that the wide angle lens gave the pictures. It's much more in tune with how I envision the pictures, how I see. So back to the boardwalk on Coney Island. So I remember this guy was a huge Batman fan, and he let me take his picture because my name is Bruce, like Bruce Wayne. So the thing about shooting 8x10 large format is that it's super easy to make really boring pictures because it's cumbersome and big and slow. And so you kind of want to rush through parts when you shouldn't be. And the only way to get past that is really to try and connect with who you're photographing if you're doing portraiture. And I learned to be a really super careful listener. Okay, so I found myself returning again and again to Prospect Park because it really had all I needed. It's such an amazing microcosm of New York, really the world. You know, just the amount of languages that you hear is astounding just walking around Prospect Park. So my work started to change also at this point, and I think slowing down and getting closer really had a lot to do with it. So by the way, the name Deep Park is a play on the term deep state, which Trump was using a lot during the campaign when he was insisting that there was a deep state democratic conspiracy. So this is one of my favorites because of Ali's totally open expression and that beautiful luminosity from that late in the day light. You know, working with the big camera with large format, it slows everything down and you really have to give in to its own rhythm. And I end up using time like a raw material, just like film. And it's at first it's like I'm building something and I need their help. But then we're all invested in it, and it becomes we're building something together, and that's where it becomes more of a collaboration. At its core, I think Deep Park really just allowed me to look into somebody's eyes and know that we're more than just strangers. And I think in a nutshell, that's what this project meant. That's what it was about. Okay, so these three women approached me because they were interested in the unusual camera, which is one of the benefits of using an unusual camera, because it could be a talking point. It also adds validation because it looks serious, and so maybe they think my series, my project is serious. So I asked them if they wouldn't mind sitting down and in the dirt, and they were fine with it, and they just collapsed into this really beautiful arrangement. So Rachel and Austin were actually photographing each other when I first saw them. They were using like one of those nice little Fuji Instax instant film cameras. And it seemed to me like it was kind of a private moment. So I held back and waited, which I often do. And I wait for the right time to approach people. I try to sense whether people are open to me approaching them. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll set up my camera nearby someone I want to photograph with the hope that they approach me out of curiosity. And the chance of getting a picture increases exponentially if they do that. I think there's a lot of psychology involved in this. So these were, a lot of them were like really dim. It was dimmer than this. And I remember my exposure was like a half second. You could see in the upper right corner, there's like a person walking or running, and it didn't barely even register. So Greg and Emma, I found out after we did this shot that this was their first date. And I think this picture kind of picks up some of that in it. And I like the way Emma's just holding on to that blade of grass. I don't think they wanted to look too lovey-dovey in this picture. So the first thing I noticed about Joey as she approached the bench was her limp. She was limping, and I was interested in that. And so, you know, I become interested in people for so many different, you know, reasons. It could be, you know, an article of clothing that they're wearing, or just how they hold their body, their geometry, or it could be an expression that I just can't read, and that interests me. But I'm also interested in limps. So we got to talking, and she told me that she had polio as a kid, and her mom was suspicious of the new vaccine, and which is understandable because, you know, it means pumping polio into your kid. Who would want that? So she wasn't inoculated, and then she got the disease. And I can't imagine what her mother felt like. So all you anti-vacciners out there, this one's for you. This is one of my favorites, and I think it's because it's such a difficult read. I keep coming back to it, and you know, something about the look on her face and the way she's holding her body, it's intriguing to me, and also the way the light on the left side, it almost looks like the earth is dropping down. I just think this picture is very intriguing. I love this one. So shots like this, I think, really typify my need to create something beautiful at a time when I felt that there was so much ugliness going around everywhere. And I think I needed to turn it around for my own sake. So in that respect, I think there's definitely an element of selfishness involved in this work. It's really for me. But I think people relate to that. And I think maybe that's why a lot of people seem to like some of these pictures. Maybe they get it. They get it. They have that feeling. Like these moments of gentle grace. I showed Hulissa, that's her name, this picture. I sent it by email to her, and she couldn't believe it. And she loved it. She sent me this text saying, "OMG, I can't believe that's me," and with like a half dozen heart emojis, and it was really sweet response. And I think she was just really taken aback to see herself differently this way, almost sublime. And I think it's really difficult for people to see themselves that way, and I think it's a shame. So this is a vocal group called Mad Empire. They were practicing and I overheard them and I kind of waited again. But I took like 2 frames, 2 sheets of film, and then the sky opened. It just poured buckets down like so quickly. It was insane. I had to throw my stuff into my bags and run into the woods to gain cover, and I got soaked. That's that story. Hands are really important. Hands, okay? I think they're often overlooked in portraiture, and so I don't do that. I really try to be very aware of what hands are doing in my pictures. All of these pictures resolve something in me, something I want, something. Everyone has something for me to love about it. And these pictures with blankets in them, they're kind of like, I love them. They're kind of like flying carpets. But they're also like clearly defined private spaces. You can't just go over and sit next to them on that blanket. That would be weird if you just walked over and sat on their blanket. It would be weird even if there wasn't a blanket and you went over and sat right next to them, but the blanket makes it even more defined. So I like that. And during a portrait session, if we have a good connection, there's also like an invisible room that kind of like, you know, forms around us and isolates us. And it all happens in this public space. And I'm really fascinated on how we construct these private spaces in public areas. And I look for people who are in that space, and I really try not to break it, or at least not to shatter it completely, and use it as a starting point. So when I'm shooting, I might make a gentle suggestion, like I might request a shift or a slight turn in the head, so to see what if the light looks differently on them or whatever. But that always invariably elicits some other additional body event that happens. Like they'll turn, but then they'll do something else. But and as the photographer, I have to be ready. It's my job to notice those additional unexpected gestures, because it's at that point when I might ask them to hold still for the picture. And because more often than not, what they did on their own inadvertently is more interesting than what I requested. So this is Jamie and Missy. I remember looking through the ground glass of the camera, almost transfixed on how gorgeous this looked. You know, if you don't know, the ground glass is the 8x10 piece of frosted glass on the back of the camera that I can compose and focus on. In general, that experience, seeing the image cast onto that on the camera's ground glass is magical, and it never gets old for me. It just continues to amaze. And in case you didn't know, that image is upside down that I see, and also backwards. So it's a real abstraction. And I actually like that. I think that helps me in composing, because, you know, although I'm interacting with the person on one level, but at the same time, I'm arranging shapes and blocks of light to make a composition that feels right on a different, purely visual level. It's kind of complex and all-encompassing, but very sensual. It's a very sensual experience. So what I remember about this picture is that as soon as Sandra thought that we were done shooting, like all of the tension in her body just left, and she transformed into this lovely, very relaxed position. And so I had to make one more shot. I had to ask her just to hold just for that one. And of course, that's the one that worked the best. I love this one, and to my eye, it looks almost like a flat painted canvas that they're kind of attached to. One of the things, and it almost looks like a diorama. One of the things I love about shooting large format is its inherent quality of spatial compression, which is when things in the background appear to get pulled closer to the foreground because it's long focal length lenses. And this shot expresses that really nicely. And it's just a look, it's just a personal look that I like. So this is Summer and Mo. And there was a nice New York Times Lens blog feature about Deep Park, and they printed this one rather large in it, and this is it. And I was afraid I was going to hate the crappy reproduction quality of the cheap newsprint. So I was really shocked on how much I really loved looking at these pictures in this new way, because they almost looked like, it felt like they were not even my pictures anymore, like they were done by a different photographer. So I really enjoyed them in a completely new way. And it's weird, but it's cool. Stefan and Dominique, I like watching relationships shift in front of the camera. And so there's this performative aspect to all of portraiture, which is something that I'm really interested in. And it plays out in different ways. And in this picture, I really love their arms nested like that within each other. And it's a shape that's also repeated in Dominique's pendant. I don't know if you guys could see it, maybe if you have a really big monitor, but she's wearing a pendant that's a heart within a heart. And it really mimics that gesture of their arms. And in the second picture, Dominique's hand wraps around Stefan's finger. And for me, that subtle change makes it a completely unique, different picture. And there's something that gets shifted back and forth between them that shows up. And it's just a real honor when people let you into their space like this. So I like this one too. And I'm not sure what it is that gives some people a certain power, but to me, they had a lot of it. Maybe it's because they seem to be like so impenetrable as a couple. And I also really like the chipped fingernail polish on his hand. But I couldn't not take this picture. I couldn't stop looking at them. So beautiful, intense gaze. And I remember looking through the ground glass and being really impressed by the texture of her sweater, and also of how the late in the day light was defining her hands really nicely like that. And I typically found that no matter how early I left the house, I'd end up shooting at the end of the day when there was barely any light left. And I think this is a shortcoming on my behalf as a photographer. It really takes a lot for me to approach people. And so there are many opportunities during the day. I'm just walking around for hours and I just don't have the courage or not be able to pull together. And as the day goes on, I'm feeling the pressure to shoot. And so as the clock is ticking, I kind of put myself in this position. I change. I morph into somebody who could do this kind of thing. Like I rise to the occasion. And so it's always like the light is leaving really quickly. And really amazed that I simply nailed focus and exposure properly, because there's so many ways that the shot could go completely wrong. Every now and then I come across a park that I like this little clearing, and I know that I'll want to use it at some point in a picture, so I might file it away in my brain and come back there. Or like that day, I just set my camera up and just kind of waited and, interacted with people walking by. And I started talking with these men and just asked them if they wouldn't mind walking over here and sitting in my temporary studio. And here's that shot. So the first time I noticed this gentleman was like a week prior. He was feverishly writing in a notebook in red ink, and I remember his shoes had no shoelaces. I was intrigued with this guy, but by the time I was able to approach him, he had picked up and left. But a week later, this day, I saw him again in a completely different part of the park. So I beelined over to him this time and introduced myself, and he actually remembered me, so we had that memory in common. And so we took this picture. I didn't have my big camera with me that day, my 8x10, it was a 2.25. So we arranged to come back the following week or something, and we took this one. And I think working from the side of the camera as I do is really important, because I'm not obscured in any way, and it makes it easier to converse and connect and establish trust, which is really important with the kind of work I'm doing. So, as I was putting this presentation together, I began to look at my work in ways that I hadn't done before, and thinking about like my obsession with monster movies as a kid, and also COVID-19, how that's changing experience for everybody. And so that these portraits are bringing something different to me through that. And now I'm getting a kind of like almost an ominous feeling, like a temporary lull, a calm before the storm kind of feeling. And so that thing where an image can change meaning over time is something that's interesting to me. So this one is both beautiful and funny at the same time, which I think is a tough combination to achieve. And it has that magic carpet. So I noticed there seems to be specific threads that I see keep coming back to my work. And I was recently listening to a talk by the author Neil Gaiman on YouTube, and he said something like there were characters in his novels that resurface not by design, but by their own power and by their own volition. And that really resonated to me, with me. I do think that there are certain compelling qualities that are so universal that they, in what they represent, that they just come back. They're not quite finished saying what they have to say. They're not done with me yet. I think that happens. So now I'm starting to run into people who I photographed years before, and that's what happened with Sharon, who I photographed for the Perfect Strangers project a few years prior. So now I see her a lot in the park, and we sit and talk, we've become friends. So the difference, I wanted to point out the difference between the portrait I did a few years ago of Sharon and the one I did for Deep Park is really striking. That the Deep Park one is so much more intimate and full of trust. And this is Bob, who's known for his beautiful crocheted hats that he makes and sells in the park. He sits like a Zen master for like 10 hours a day in the same spot. And now I own the whole collection of his hats. So this is Edgar Oliver, who you might be familiar with. He's a writer, a poet, performer, and he does like amazing monologues. He's known for his strange and beautiful stories about growing up in Savannah, Georgia, with his sister Helen, and his eccentric mother. Anyway, I've always been a huge fan of Edgar for years, and I've always wanted to photograph him. And as luck would have it, I found him sitting by himself on a bench one late Sunday afternoon in the park in July.
Bruce, I have a question here from Eric Hasson.
Okay.
And he says, will you continue the project given the current social distancing policy?
It's a problem. I really don't know what's happening. I mean, I think coronavirus might have the last word on what happens for all of us. You know, I'd like to continue. We'll see what happens. You know, will I be photographing people with masks on? I don't know. So here's a picture of me, Bob, and Edgar, photographed by Sharon. So I like how that kind of comes together. So we've become friends, and I've started an extended portrait series of Edgar. It's kind of an offshoot of Deep Park. And somebody recently commented that as crazy as it might sound, and I'm quoting this, we seem to have an inexplicable way of attracting the right subjects. And I love that line. And I don't know if it's true, but I do love that line. So this was actually the very first portrait I did of Edgar the day we first met. And it was also the very first time I ever had 8x10 color films. First time I ever used 8x10 color film. So it was really fortuitous. And this was from our second meeting. And I also did recently a series of pictures from Edgar's theatrical performance called Victor.
Bruce, I noticed from your resume that you went to NYU for photography, but that you also worked with a portraitist that I greatly admire, Rosalind Solomon. And there are different kinds of education. Is there anything that you can share with us about working with Rosalind? Did it impact you in any particular way, or did you take away any valuable lessons from that time?
Rosalind, I was getting married, and she said, well, okay, well, that's the end of your art. That's my Rosalind Solomon story. But she had an amazing eye and a very specific way of wanting her prints to look. They had to have a very signature kind of look to them. They had a certain contrast. And so it was kind of an education on how certain artists and their vision is carried from inception of the photo through the final process of the print and the presentation. And so I think I learned that from Rosalind. She was very much, those issues were very important to her. It had to look like a Rosalind Solomon picture. Mm-hmm. And so I think some of that bled off to me too. I think some of I spend an awful lot of time on how my pictures feel. And maybe I took some of that from Rosalind. Anyway, basically, that wraps my presentation. And the uncertainty about everything that involves the future now makes it impossible to say when or if I'll be able to continue, how soon Prospect Park, and or offshoots of that, like working with Edgar, which I'd love to do. We're planning on doing more work together. We're in contact. You know, we've been pretty hit hard here in New York. Maybe Zoom portraiture will be a thing. I don't know. But I'm just hoping for the best, like everyone. So thank you for logging in and for spending time.
Mhm. Yes, thank you, Bruce. And yes, Tom is clapping, so am I. I'm sure some of our other audience members too, even if we're all muted. But here's a question from Kent Meister. And he says, have you thought about doing a book or some other kind of physical end product for Deep Park?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I actually had been sequencing images for a book for a while, and I've been talking with some potential publishers. So that's definitely going to happen. So keep your eyes open for Deep Park, the book.
Going back to the idea that coronavirus has changed everything for New Yorkers, especially for New Yorkers, but you know, in general, for everybody living around the world. Well, that is an apocalyptic way to finish a project that would be forced on you. Hopefully, that's not how Deep Park is going to come to a closure. Generally speaking, let's say that you do get back to the project. When would you know that the project is done? Do you have any insight into that?
Such a great question, and I've asked myself that a lot. I mean, I've been continuing, you know, I was going out, continuing to go out, and I was ready, willing, and able to continue. And I think it'll end like it started, in an organic manner. And I think it's dependent on how much involved I get with these other tangential offshoots from Deep Park, like working in collaboration with people like Edgar, that I love doing. So it might naturally come to a conclusion by nature of me focusing more work on other things that are happening. You know, I'll see if I can manage both or all these things at once, but
Yeah.
it's a really a difficult question. It's a great question. I certainly have enough images to fill the idea of the book that I have. That might be the answer. You know, maybe when I'm holding the book, maybe I'll feel like it's done. But right now, it doesn't quite feel done yet to me.
Okay. And do you think Edgar might write a title essay for your book? Is that something that, do you think Edgar might write a title essay for the book?
Edgar has actually already agreed to write an afterword for the book, which is something that I really look forward to.
Nice.
So there's someone else I'm thinking for the forward, but Edgar's definitely doing the afterword.
Okay. I have a question here from our department chair, Tom Ash, and he says, when you produced your 4-hour portrait sessions in the basement studio, how many sheets of 8x10 would you typically expose?
Okay, so, well, not as many as you might think. So in the basement, in this controlled, which I'm talking to you from right now, in a controlled setting, and I have access to more film holders than I do in the field, I'll shoot anywhere from 10 to 20, but that's about it. Usually not that much. In the field, for Deep Park, I'll shoot, you know, in a decent session, 8 to 14 images, depending on lots of factors that I don't have control over, like if someone needs to leave or if the weather changes. But I like to shoot 14 because that's the amount of film hangers that I could develop in my darkroom at once. So I have that in my mind also. Also, when I'm out in the field, I take two types of film, two speeds of film, depending on the light. So it's almost always black and white, but I'll take like six film holders of, 7 film holders of 400 speed and 7 film holders of 125. So I like to be prepared. I'm out for the entire day pretty much, so I don't want to be unprepared. So I'll take, different types of film.
All right. Well, you mentioned something earlier regarding the Basement Studio series about by the time this is over, you'll probably hate me.
Yes.
How did that pan out? Did people really hate you, or were they really?
It's further exhaustion.
Uh-huh.
I can't really, I don't really think anybody really hated me. I think they were tired of me at the moment. And I think that went away the following day, especially,
Okay.
when I have pictures to show them, and that gets very exciting. So, I think that we're both really wiped out. And I think there's a degree of, let me out of here, but I don't think it really ever went into hate.
Okay. Couldn't resist asking you that. There's a couple more questions that just came in, and maybe we'll end with those. So I'll combine them. There's a question from Gloria Nelson, where she says, when shooting strangers, do you get releases? And then there is a question from CA. How do you manage the challenge of approaching strangers for portraits? Has it gotten easier over the years?
Well, they're both good questions. And the first question is no, I don't get releases. And as an artist working outdoors in a public place, there's no legal issue as long as I don't use their image to sell coffee mugs or a product. But I could show it as art and even print it in a book. So the second question is a little more, is not as cut and dry, is not as easy to answer. So it's never easy to approach strangers. And I think, it's not easy for the people I'm approaching, and it's not, you have to remember I'm a stranger also, so it works both ways. I think that it's really a matter of being sensitive, to the people around you, to pick up vibes and to sense, and quite frankly, there are many times I'll start talking to somebody and then I'll disengage because I just feel like it's not going to happen for whatever reason. I think it got easier because I know what to expect, and I'm used to having certain feelings and picking up on certain cues from people. So in some ways, I've gotten a little better at picking up these cues. It becomes kind of a dance in a way. It's like, oh, make a move, they'll make a move, how do we interact? So it's easier in that I'm used to the process. I don't think I necessarily manage more images per day. I'm lucky if I get one. Percentage-wise, if I go out, 7 days a week to shoot in the park, which would be a lot because I don't usually do it 7 days a week, but I would say I'll shoot maybe 30% of the time. A lot of times I just come home and I haven't shot anything. So I keep going back. So I'll go through these spells where I won't shoot for quite a long time, and it really kind of affects me, but it doesn't affect me as much anymore because I know what's going to happen. I know that tomorrow is going to happen. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I don't know if that really answered the question. but I'm more used to the whole process, so it's not surprising how people respond to me. You know, I could be charming when I need to be, and I try to be. I try to be conscientious and again, a good listener. And I think people are responsive to that. I think that if they see you as someone who's really listening to what they're saying, I think they respond in kind.
All right. There's one more question just came in, and I'll include that as well, and then we'll have to call it a night. But this is one that's from Louis Raffler. Any epic fails that were possibly funny and a lesson to us all?
Any epic fails? Louis is the person who I photographed, who you saw on screen when I was telling you about how long this process was.
Okay.
So
full circle.
Full circle is right. Well, embarrassing on my behalf, where I would do, this happened once in a bad way, where I did a session with somebody and I double exposed everything. I shot film that was already loaded, that I had shot already, someone else. So that was an epic fail, embarrassing on my behalf. You try and learn from your mistakes. Occasionally I'll still double expose things, but that's in the field. You know, I thought I flipped a film, you know, the film holders have two sheets, one on either side, and you shoot one and then you flip it over and you shoot the other side. Every now and then, and it doesn't happen that much anymore, but I'll double expose, I'll forget to flip it. But it happened in the studio once, and I had to reshoot, I had to reschedule, and it took a lot to make that happen. So my fuck up, my bad.
All right, well, on that note, you know, one epic failure every year or every 2 years helps us all stay honest. And thank you for your candor and for taking us with you into the deep park of Prospect and getting us out of ourselves. And we enjoyed this so much. Thanks a million, Bruce. Thanks everybody for being in attendance.
Bye, guys.